the proud Texan and Houstonian with a Princeton education just visible around the edges, James A. Baker knew how to make Washington work for his closest friend, George H.W. Bush, and for our nation. While he never held an elected position himself, his deft hand artfully shaped 4 presidential administrations. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, and welcome to the second annual Gail Koppman History Lecture. With us this evening are Suzanne Glasser and her husband, Peter Baker. And while he is not related to the subject of their important and refreshing biography, his and Susan's mastery of the subject would make you think that they'd always been at Mr. Baker's side. The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, demonstrated by a number of favorable reviews, will be considered, I'm sure, Jim Baker's definitive biography. Joining them this evening in conversation is Professor Jeffrey Engel, Director of SMU's Center for Presidential History, who has written extensively about George Bush and Jim Baker. And I recommend highly Jeff's book, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. Let me remind you that and I hope that you can always purchase a copy of The Man Who Ran Washington at interabangbooks.com. And frequent viewers know that you may get a 10% discount at Interabang Books online store. Just remember to type in the code dfwworld, not just that 10% for The Man Who Ran Washington, but for any books that happen to be in your shopping cart. I want to thank our co-presenters, the Fort Worth Club, the SMU Center for Presidential History, and the SMU Tower Center, as well as promotional partners, the Foreign Policy Association, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, the World Affairs Council of New Orleans, and the World Affairs Councils of America. And let me remind you as well that if you're not yet a member of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth or World Affairs Council in your community, I hope you soon will become one. You can always keep up with our programs by going to our website at dfwworld.org or go to YouTube, dfwworld, that's our channel. But before I turn it over to Jeff, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's program and why it's so special. Before COVID-19 changed our plans, as well as the date of this book's publication, Peter and Susan were to be speakers at the second annual Gail Koppman History Endowed Lecture. It's a lecture that's been made possible through the generosity of Gail's husband, Ed, and their daughter, Catherine. Gail passed away about 5 years ago after a courageous battle with brain cancer. Oh, how she loved teaching. And her students loved her. She was always so happy when they came back from college to visit her at Good Shepherd Episcopal School, where she taught 7th and 8th graders. In fact, Ed reminded me that for the last 2 decades, she taught every single student that graduated from Good Shepherd. Ed also said she particularly liked teaching this age group, while some thought it was challenging, but she found the curiosity of her students to be at their peak, and that's what she loved. Gail was my friend, and the thought of her smile, whether running around the block near their home in Dallas or shepherding students to a World Affairs Council program, will always be a treasured memory for me and for those who had the privilege of knowing Gail Koppman. May her memory be a blessing. And now, Jeff Engel, I turn it over to you, and I look forward to a very great conversation this evening.
Thank you, Jim. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here to discuss this book and also to participate in a lecture series that is to celebrate history teaching. And in the memory of Mrs. Koppman, you know, I have to admit, I actually just lost my own advisor from graduate school just a few weeks ago. And it reminds us that we are nothing more than the mentors that we find over time. So thank you to the Koppman family for giving us this opportunity. And it is really a wonderful opportunity because we have, as far as I can tell, the 2 best political journalists in Washington with us today. I mean, they're going to blush and say they're not, but we all know it's true. In fact, the 2 which I always make a point to read. In fact, what's really interesting is that when I'm reading them, sometimes, you know, just the way it comes up on my phone in the morning, I don't actually see that it's their byline until I'm somewhat through the story. And I say to myself, this sounds like Susan, or this sounds like Peter. And lo and behold, if it's interesting, it always is. So they are here today to discuss their new book, a little bit delayed, but now out for us, this wonderful biography of James Baker, which, I mean, to say it's going to be and is the definitive biography really underwhelms the word definitive. I can't imagine anyone ever wanting to write about this man or this period again without picking up this book. So it's really wonderful pleasure to discuss the book, and they have graciously agreed to discuss, in addition to Baker, you know, a few of the odd and end things that might be happening in our nation's capital recently or according to the last tweet. So thank you for that, guys. Without further ado, Peter Baker writes for the New York Times. Susan Glasser has been an editor at any number of places, including Politico, and this is their wonderful book. Welcome, guys. Good to see you again.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
So we're going to kick right off with some Baker. How did he get where he was? And specifically, you know, successful Houston lawyer, successful member of the Houston community, who goes from what, no political engagement whatsoever to running the campaign for president of the United States within 3 years?
Basically,
who is this guy?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, let me thank everybody who's on the call tonight. It's such a great treat to be with you guys. We wish we could do it in person. Thank you, Jim, for hosting us, and Jeff for moderating. This is really a great honor for us. And if you haven't bought Jeff's book, seriously, it's a great book. When the World Seemed New is really the definitive piece. Talking about definitive, that's definitive, the definitive work on really the most extraordinary moment in our foreign policy, I think, of our lifetime. So it overlaps a lot with our book to some extent. Jeff was incredibly generous in helping us with our research. I say, in answer to your question, Jim Baker, you're right, was an unlikely political power broker, an unlikely international diplomat. His family, prominent in Houston for years, he went into corporate law because that's what his dad told him he was supposed to do. That's what his grandfather had done and his great-grandfather had done. And he, you know, perfectly happy tootling along for, you know, basically the first 4 decades of his life without having anything to do with politics. The family rule was, you know, stay out of politics, in fact. But he had begun to get bored, and he had a friend from the tennis courts of the Houston Country Club named George H.W. Bush. And it was really a tragedy in his life that kind of began pushing him in a different direction. I think he'd already begun showing interest in politics, but when his first wife, Mary Stewart, fell ill, it was really George H.W. Bush who was there for him. In fact, the only person Jim Baker even told that the diagnosis was terminal was George Bush. We had a letter in this book. It's remarkable that Baker writes to Bush and says, I'm not telling Mary Stewart this. I'm not telling my mother this. I'm not telling the kids this. I'm telling you. Nothing will forge a bond between two people than that kind of secret. And when Mary Stewart did pass away, the last people who saw her outside of her family were George and Barbara Bush. So when he was trying to get through this tragedy, it's George Bush who says, come work for me on the Senate campaign. Come help me run for office in Texas. And Baker did, and he discovered he liked it.
And then what? Because, you know, 3 years later, you know,
Well, that's right. I mean,
I could volunteer so successfully.
Exactly. You know, George Bush, as everybody knows by now, was a real friend maker. He was a networker, not just a Christmas card list sender, but you know, just in person. And Bush and Baker were both beneficiaries, in a way, unintended beneficiaries of essentially the neutron bomb that was Watergate. Watergate wiped out the leadership class of the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. at just the time when Baker was finally interested in breaking out of the family constraints and looking at doing something in politics and public service. And in fact, amazingly enough, he actually had an interview. I didn't know this till we worked on the book. He had an interview for a senior job at the Nixon Justice Department on the very day that Nixon had to shake up his administration, firing his top White House aides, firing the Attorney General in an effort to staunch the bleeding from Watergate. So Jim Baker also had luck on his side, clearly, and he did not go to work for the scandal-tarred Nixon administration. Bided his time. Eventually, that George Bush network seems to have kicked in gear, and he actually was appointed to an obscure position in the Commerce Department. Well, I can tell you up here in Washington, the idea that you go from an obscure job in the Commerce Department to running the president's campaign in 1 year's time doesn't happen. The Commerce Department was not then, and it is not now, the center of the action in any administration. So it's, again, a sort of incredible coincidence of luck and timing and great skill that made it all happen for Jim Baker.
And what were those skills? Because he over the course of the next few decades, obviously, he's at the pinnacle of American politics, at Treasury, at the State Department, obviously, White House Chief of Staff for Ronald Reagan. What were the actual skills that people saw, aside from the friendship with George Bush?
Right. Yeah. Well, part of it, of course, is discipline, preparation. He was famous for preparation. His kids got sick of him, I'm sure, telling him the family motto was the 5 Ps, which is preparation prevents poor performance. Our own 15-year-old now can say that in his sleep. I think that, but as Susan likes to say, Washington is filled with, hardworking, ambitious, burn the candle at both ends kind of people. That's by itself wouldn't do it. Well, clearly, he had, that a lot of people don't, is a natural instinct for understanding both the levers of power and how they worked, understanding what the person on the other side of the table needed or wanted in order how to get what you want. Hedrick Smith, who was the famous New York Times correspondent, said that, covered him at the time, said Baker understood, the billiards balls of politics, how the balls ricocheted off of each other and where they would end up at the end of the shot. And that was something that he showed basically early on in his time in Washington. And a young White House Chief of Staff took notice of this, a guy named Dick Cheney, and said, we're going to have you come in and help us because the guy we planned to have count our delegates at the convention just passed away in a car accident, and Baker seemed to have the right instincts. Cheney was the one who brought him in.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to drill down a little bit because of my interest and, of course, the name of the group that we're talking with, into his foreign policy, which, of course, first question, where should we begin in trying to understand his foreign policy? Do we look at the Chief of Staff years? Do we look at his Treasury years? Where do you think that his sense of what a Secretary of State should ultimately do comes from? Or came from, I should say.
It is a great question because there was very little in his previous background to suggest an interest in world affairs or foreign policy. He saw the world as a young Marine who was assigned during the Korean War actually to the Mediterranean and not that. So, he had a passing familiarity with the capitals of Europe, but was not a big internationalist in his career in any way. Certainly at Princeton, I tried to ask him, given what happened later in his life, the end of the Cold War, well, what kind of point of view did you have about the Soviet Union? What background did you have in Russia? He laughed and he said, my main interest in Russia was because my tennis coach in Houston growing up was a refugee from White Russia, before the Russian Revolution, a man named Andrew Jitkov, who was as close to him as a second father. So, he wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't a Kissinger in waiting. The words Treaty of Westphalia have never, ever sprung from Jim Baker's lips. But he was drawn early on in the Reagan administration. First of all, Bush himself loved and thrived in international affairs and foreign policy. And I suspect he transmitted some of that love to Baker. Remember that in this period when Baker's coming to Washington, Bush was the UN ambassador, pulled out of that reluctantly to go back to Washington for another job. He became the envoy to Beijing, which clearly fascinated Bush and stuck with him his whole life. So, Baker becomes Reagan's Chief of Staff. I'm sure we'll talk about that more because that's an unlikely transition as well. And what's interesting is that he's widely held to be sort of the gold standard of White House Chiefs of Staff. And yet it was an exhausting, grueling job. There was so much infighting in the Reagan administration. At first, Baker, saying, I have no experience with foreign policy, was not involved with that and left that to some of his rivals in the Reagan White House, but he quickly determined that he needed to be involved with foreign policy. So I date his interest to the Reagan years, because in fact, he actually tried to engineer his swap from White House Chief of Staff to National Security Advisor 2 years into Reagan's administration. I did not know that until we did this book, and actually, it's a rare example of Jim Baker screwing up, and he had cleverly maneuver it so he was going to get rid of a rival and place himself in that national security job, and he was going to put Mike Deaver in as Chief of Staff, and they got Reagan to say yes. They handed him a piece of paper that he was supposed to go read in the White House press room to announce this. But he made a fatal mistake, Baker did, which is when Reagan was called to the Situation Room for a meeting with this national security team in which he was going to announce the job switch, Baker didn't go with him. And William Clark, Baker's vanquished rival, upon learning of this scheme, was able to rally the people at the meeting to oppose it vigorously with Reagan. He came back to the Oval Office, called up Baker and Deaver, and he said, "I'm not going out to the briefing room, fellas, we've got a problem." So I think that, you know, really from early on in the Reagan years, Baker had his eye on the State Department.
So what does that story tell us both about Reagan and about Baker as an implementer of ideas? I mean, we think of Reagan as both a person with big ideas and, to be fair, he was not a micromanager. So where does Baker come in making Reagan successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. His early experience in foreign affairs as the chief of staff would have been legislative, right? Getting the AWACS sales to the Saudis through Congress, that kind of thing. And I think that the more he spent time in the West Wing doing Reagan's, you know, putting his agenda into place, I think he began to see foreign affairs as the more worthy area, that's the place where you could really be a statesman. You could get away from the sort of, you know, grubby politics of domestic policy and legislative affairs and act on a bigger stage, right? So I think that was the interest in being national security advisor. I think that was, you know, when he became Treasury Secretary, it wasn't quite Secretary of State, but felt like perhaps a step toward that. And so I think you're right. And we ask him now, you become Secretary of State, you have no experience. As well, you know, being Treasury Secretary gave me some experience. And there's something to that. You have to negotiate, as he did with other finance ministers, about currency exchange rates, about, you know, financial issues and so forth. So he did begin to get experience in that sense on the world stage, but he did not have a Kissingerian, as we say, philosophy. He was a very transactional guy. I think that's the way he saw diplomacy, is how do you get things done?
Well, and it's that transactional nature, I think, that makes him such a fascinating and successful diplomat. You know, once there is a transaction to be pursued. I mean, one of the things that I'm struck with in reading about Baker during this period is how consistent his views are with the standard interpretations of American foreign policy at the time. You know, America is the stabilizing force in the world. America must be defender of Europe. America must be, you know, in favor of expanding trade, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any place where Baker deviates from the dogma, if you will, of Washington?
Well, again, there's always been a vigorous back and forth, you know, perhaps you could argue within, you know, kind of defined 40-yard lines, but, you know, Jim Baker was not a hawk. And there was enormous pressures inside both the Reagan and Bush administrations from the far right flank of the party. And that was had real political consequences for both Bush and Baker, and they were acutely conscious of it. And it was something that, you know, even trying to deal with the unraveling of the Soviet Union, there were enormous internecine disputes. So it wasn't just the more, you know, famously faction-ridden Reagan administration. You know, we're more familiar with that. But it was in the Bush administration, too. There really were doctrinal differences. And what we found is that even late in life, when we were interviewing Secretary Baker, and he was very generous with us and spending time with us and talking about these issues over the last few years, even well into his 80s, I would say that that's what I came away with, that his sort of center of gravity in terms of foreign policy is a real sense of American leadership, but in a very diplomatic sense. And he's a believer in international alliances, in coalitions, in consultations, you know, with America at the head of the table. Again, he's a believer in leadership, but he was not excited about the first Gulf War, never mind the second Gulf War. And, you know, he supported President Bush in that, obviously, and was the one who went on to build the coalition, which he was so successful at once given the task. It actually became almost the first war in American history to turn a profit because he successfully done so many allies for contributions. But that's really, I think, where Baker comes down. He is fundamentally very skeptical of the use of American military power and force in the world, and would be very, very restrained in using it.
So, Oh, Peter, please go ahead.
I have to say, to Susan's point, I remember we were interviewing one time in his ranch in Wyoming, and we were talking about, this is a few years ago, and he was just saying, he talked about the Iraq War and all these other wars. He says, no more wars, no more wars. He just felt very, like a lot of Americans, are, you know, just sort of like exhausted by our constant, you know, military engagements overseas. In fact, for the 2016 race, I think he was initially kind of intrigued with Rand Paul, which sounds a little funny because Rand is much more of an isolationist, you know, thinking kind of person than Baker is. But he was so, I think, tired of military engagement, right? That Paul for a while kind of intrigued him a little bit. Obviously, he supported Jeb Bush once Jeb jumped into the race, but I thought that was really interesting.
So you've alluded to this a couple of times already, but could you give our viewers a sense of how you came to this project, and also, you know, the incredible access that you had, and also, frankly, the positives and negatives of that access as you saw them?
Well, I mean, first of all, Secretary Baker has been extraordinarily generous. You're right that for anyone writing a biography, you know, the conventional view is that it's best done when your subject is not around to second guess you. But I would say for Peter and I, certainly it was a relief in some ways from, you know, the daily combat in Washington and an increasingly contentious relationship between the media and recent White Houses. So, you know, obviously for us, it was wonderful to have full cooperation from not only Secretary Baker and his wife. We interviewed all 8 of their children, his 106-year-old nanny, you know, members of the Bush family, and, you know, we also had great access to Baker's papers at Princeton, where no one had really gone through them before, as well as to his papers at the Baker Institute in Houston. So it was an open book in a way that was really, really, I think, exciting for Peter and I. You know, he had a reputation, well-deserved, I think, as a very careful steward of his image, and yet neither of us experienced any effort on Baker's part really to, you know, put the spin on the ball or argue with us over interpretations of things. You know, he perhaps, having published 2 memoirs of his own and being in, at the time, his mid and late 80s, perhaps he just understood that, you know, you can't really be seen as a serious figure in history unless a serious independent book of history has been written about you. But he was very interested and engaged in the project, but you know, we felt very independent. It was not an authorized biography, I should point out, and you know, he wasn't reviewing the book before it was published or anything.
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you, it's really actually,
yeah.
So you mentioned that the book was supposed to be published in May, right? And as Susan said, our plan was not to show it to him in advance so that we could make sure everybody understood this is not his book, it's our book, and he didn't have anything to do with how it came out, for good or bad. But because it was delayed from May to September, Baker, being Baker, somehow through his own sources got a copy of it. It wasn't, not from us. We didn't give it to him, and I still don't know to this day where he got it from. I don't know if you do, but
he sent it to a lot of people.
Yeah, we sent it to the guy. So he read it anyway, and his office passed along his, you know, a couple pages of corrections, and we're like, oh gosh, what's that's going to be, you know, because there's a lot of things in there that he might not enjoy, that he might take issue with, interpretations, criticism, and so on. That would be natural. To his credit, all of the things he sent over were strictly factual. You know, I had a rifle that day, not a shotgun when I went hunting. This person was on the phone or that person was not on the phone. They were all strictly factual. He made no effort, 0 effort, even though he had in front of him, he could have, to say, hey, you guys, you got it wrong. You know, you're believing somebody else, and that's just not the way it happened. I tell you, he had no, he lived up to the deal he made with us from the very start, which is to be an open book and to let us write it as we saw it.
That's great. You know, I really wish more former policymakers were quite both as open and also understanding that scholars and writers and biographers have a different job than the people who make the history. You know, a funny story, if I may, when I did my book on President Bush's China diary, I received a whole list of mistakes that I made from the Chinese embassy. And I was very excited. I thought, oh my goodness, this is great. They've identified the right people for me. They went in the other direction. They did not enjoy my discussion of Tiananmen, for example. They didn't like the word crackdown. I suggested brouhaha, but that didn't work either. But let me dive into Tiananmen, if you will. That is my interview with James Baker about Tiananmen was the only time, I think, in my professional life where I've ever run out of questions, because he gave one-word answers to everything. And I interpreted that he didn't want to talk about Tiananmen because Tiananmen was not a moment that he thought he shined or America shined. So discuss that moment if you could, but also what moment did you find that he was most proud of as he went forward?
That part of your book is fabulous. The Tiananmen part of When the World Seemed New is a great account of that.
You know, I mean, look, I think I would have guessed something like that. You know, one critique of Baker throughout his career in Washington was that he was very good at taking credit and very quick to disappear when there was blame to be handed out and not credit. And, you know, Tiananmen is a classic example of that. He would tell people for years, well, you know, Bush, having been the U.S. envoy to Beijing, that he was the desk officer for China. And, you know, he really saw this or portrayed it in later years as Bush himself and Scowcroft, you know, being in the lead, which is interesting because, of course, he was extremely zealous in guarding his prerogatives as Secretary of State when it came to many other matters. And we document a lot of examples of that in the book. But, you know, I think perhaps it's fair to say that he did not consider himself to be an expert on China. It was not his portfolio. He was not very much of an ideologue in foreign policy. So, you know, issues like human rights and the internal repression of China were not the way he would have viewed the world, regardless of that. You know, there's a scene in the book where Bush is discussing the fact that, you know, they want to reach out privately to the Chinese and restart interactions, which of course is still controversial to this day, understandably so. And he says to Baker, well, you know, you can't go, you're too high profile. And I just, you know, imagine that Baker was really relieved, you know, that Scowcroft was the one who landed that assignment, and probably had Bush been more insistent, Baker would have pushed back and had to tell his friend no directly. He would not have done that, in my view, no matter what.
I mean, there's the ultimate case study, though, of a very cold-eyed, very, you know, realpolitik view of the world, right? What can you get done? B, you know, what's most important? And to Bush and Baker, again, you write about this so well, the relationship more important than the moral umbrage that the world had taken over what had happened there. And they, you know, of course, he's not going to want to talk about that with you because it doesn't look very good. But from their point of view, it was more important to keep the Chinese, you know, on friendly terms.
So what is the moment that he discussed with the most pride in his voice?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that navigating the end of the Cold War and his relationship with Edward Shevardnadze, who was the Soviet foreign minister, and his ability to put together, you know, essentially the framework that brought us the peaceful reunification of Germany, which, by the way, it was just over the weekend, the 30th anniversary of that. I mean, I would say both that probably is his signal achievement, certainly as a diplomat, and probably what he would want to be remembered for. Again, we found there was this enormous push-pull in Baker, this enormous desire to be seen as a statesman and not a mere political figure, not a mere fixer. Probably, it's fair to say that he was greatest at politics, writ large, so that included international politics as well as American politics. He did run 5 national presidential campaigns. That's not a record we've seen from anyone else. And the idea that he was able to marry essentially the portfolio of a Karl Rove with a Kissinger at a very consequential moment in world history, that's what makes him so unusual. I mean, I think Peter and I, having spent 4 years in Moscow and in the former Soviet Union as bureau chiefs for the Washington Post, a mere decade after these events, you know, that was one of the things that originally drew us to Baker as a character. And, you know, your wonderful book is an example of how you could spend, you know, read a whole book about that aspect of it. But I think for us, as we got into the project of this as a biography, understanding that it occurs in the context of this political career and in the context of essentially this moment in Washington, he was the man who ran Washington, but when Washington ran the world, right, at a very specific moment in time. And I think we came away believing that he was a product of that moment as much as his individual accomplishments shined. They were made possible by how American politics worked at that time.
That's really interesting. So I see the questions building up, honestly, about today, but you know, they asked a historian to do this. So tell me, if you will, you know, I'm still puzzled, though less so obviously after your book, about trying to understand the basic ambition of Jim Baker. I mean, you know, George Bush, I could find evidence that he wanted to be president from the time he was 11. You know, Donald Trump also gives evidence of wanting to be president from around that time, among other entertaining things. Baker does talk about being president, but it doesn't seem like the driving passion that it was for others. How do we understand his role as the man who ran Washington? What did he want to run for himself?
Yeah, he only, of course, runs one time in his whole career, and that's in Texas, where you are, right, for Attorney General in 1978. We recount that in an excerpt that ran yesterday in the Houston Chronicle. It wasn't a good race for him. I mean, he did okay, but he didn't win, obviously. And in some ways, obviously, history takes a pivot turn there. Had he won, it would be, you know, we probably would not have seen George Bush maybe even be president. It's possible if Baker weren't around to run his campaign in 1980, get him on Reagan's ticket. But I think that when you're up close to a president, like a chief of staff or a secretary of state, I think there's a natural tendency to think, well, I could do this. You know, like, I'm smart enough. I know how this works. In fact, Baker arguably made, you know, the White House work for Reagan, and arguably was the most powerful person in Bush's orbit. So there was this part of him, I think, that liked the idea, that was attracted to the idea of being president. What there wasn't, I think, was an attraction to running for president, right? George H.W. Bush had a natural, you know, backslapping, baby kissing side to him. He enjoyed, I think, you know, meeting people and doing that retail politics. It wasn't Baker's strength. We talked to this Houston Chronicle reporter who covered his 1978 race, and he said he would just go through the Texas fairs in these small towns and just like walk right past people without saying, hey, I'm Jim Baker, and head straight into the tent where the county judge was, right? And he started working the county judge because that's how he understood politics. Politics was something you do behind closed doors, or in back rooms. And he wasn't, a baby kisser. So I think that in the end, he did have the ambition. We found in the archives a file folder that he had kept, really now going back, 40 some years, or maybe not 40, 35 some years, with letters from people early on when he was chief of staff or Treasury secretary saying, hey, you should run for president. Now, why do you keep those letters for 35 years if you don't harbor that ambition yourself? He did. It just wasn't the natural fit for him.
Well, and I would answer, I totally agree with that interpretation, and I would just take it back even farther to his childhood in Texas. And, you know, this is something we really didn't understand until we embarked upon the book, but, you know, Baker had a sort of crushing legacy of family expectations, but also family achievement. He was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of not only lawyers, but these were essentially builders of the city of Houston. And in particular, I think his grandfather exerted this larger than life influence both on Baker and the city of Houston. He was called Captain Baker, although he'd never actually been in the military. And he essentially founded almost all of the turn of the century institutions that still are around today in Houston. Banks and Rice University, which is a whole interesting story. He was the patron, the creator of Rice University. He was a pillar of everything. The school that Baker went to was founded by his grandfather, and his father was the board of trustees. So these men were larger than life figures, and they were builders as well. His father, I think, was not a happy man, a very controlling figure who lived in the shadow of this dominant father. And his dad, that's a great picture they're showing right now of the three of them. His dad was so strict that Baker and his friends called him the warden. And he had an ironclad family rule about staying out of politics. So actually for Baker, getting into politics in the first place was an act of rebellion. And that is a little bit different. You might think, just knowing his resume, that he was just a child of privilege and that the family network might have helped him get into politics. Quite the opposite. In fact, his mother, when he is it when he becomes Secretary of State?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, she's in her upper 90s at this age. And she says to him, you know, again, well, what is it that you know, are Secretary of? And, you know, Secretary of State of the whole United States. And she says, well, your father, you know, if he was here, he wouldn't really have allowed that. And I do think that's very important in understanding when you say, what is his ambition? There was no possibility for him to want to be president. But at the same time, there was an enormous desire to achieve something in his own right that would be his and not just his family's.
So let me segue from that to a small segue to the present, in the sense that one of the things that's remarkable about Baker is, despite being involved in so many political knife fights, you know, the 2000 election perhaps being top of the list, he still has a bipartisan reputation, or at least respect across the aisle. How did he manage that, and where'd that go?
Yeah, that's the part of the book that is the second character, right? Baker is your main character. Your other character is Washington, and how things have changed. And Baker was a creature of a time when you could be a knife fighter in the even-numbered years. Ask Michael Dukakis and Al Gore, right? They would tell you that Baker was no softie. But when it was over, it was over. And then it was time to govern, right? And so Baker in 1983 sits down with the Democrats and redoes the whole Social Security financing. And he sits down with the Democrats in 1986 and rewrites the tax code. He sits down with the Democrats again in 1989 to make the Contra War, which had been so debilitating for Reagan, go away. And his view was, there's no point in winning elections if you're not going to do something. And I think that what we see today a lot of times is such a zero-sum view of the world that today it's the other way around. You govern in order to set yourself up for the next campaign, rather than campaign to set yourself up to govern.
So what's going on today? I don't know how else to frame it. I mean, we'll start with the president and his illness. You know, he has. You're checking your phone. I have not checked my phone for the past hour.
Well,
he's done a jailbreak, it looks like. Yeah,
I'm going to have to be terribly rude, but you're going to be benefiting by having Susan help finish this off. I will give you guys the first notice. You guys will know that the president has just left Walter Reed Medical Center. He's heading back to the White House. He has convinced his doctors that he can convalesce there. And he's feeling very good. He said he's feeling better than he did 20 years ago, but keep in mind he's on steroids. And you know, people feel good when they're on steroids. So we're not sure whether he's out of the woods yet. He's not, probably. In fact, they say it won't be until next Monday. They can feel really confident that he is really past the danger stage, but he's clearly eager to get back into the campaign. He's only got 29 days to go. And so I'm gonna have to run because I have to write that story. But I agree with everything Susan's about to say. Wise husband. I know. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it. I apologize for having to run.
It's good to see you, man.
Thank you.
So Susan, you've been working in Washington journalism and politics, for, let's just say, several different types of administrations. Not just how has it changed, but how different is covering the Trump years and the Trump administration from prior administrations? I mean, to be honest, I find myself saying over and over again to my students, everything I'm going to try to teach you about American history is true up until 2016. And then things are different. Do you have the similar sense?
Look, I think that's a lot for both Peter and I. We have different roles right now. I'm, obviously writing in a weekly column in the New Yorker, so I have a different voice and a different mission than Peter's coverage. That's Ellie, the dog there. Then Peter,
my dog was just snoring in the background, so I'm glad to see another dog.
Really snores unless there's a UPS man. So sorry for that, but yeah, don't come to our house if you're a UPS person. It won't go well. Look, the thing for both Peter and I, having observed, essentially 5 presidents, I came to Washington, towards the end of the first Bush's presidency when I graduated from college, and with exceptions for being a foreign correspondent, have spent my professional career here. And I thought it was really important at the beginning of the Trump presidency for us to be able to try to communicate in our journalism, which part is truly absolutely disruptive and which part represents sort of a culmination of political trends that predate Trump, and that might represent a very partisan Republican presidency, but might be something that a President Marco Rubio or President Ted Cruz would do. And so trying throughout the last few years to understand, where is he blowing up norms that presidents of both parties have adhered to, and where is he doing things that might represent the sort of maximal use of power in a very, very partisan and polarized environment. And so, for example, I would say the Supreme Court play that's happening right now, and this idea largely pushed by Mitch McConnell that you can ram through a Supreme Court justice with essentially no process so close to a national election that your side is possibly going to lose. That is a maximalist interpretation of power. It is certainly a zero-sum view of politics. It is brute force. And it is something that represents, I would say, the culmination of where Washington has been careening towards these last few years, even predating Trump. Whereas I think you could say the president's reckless denial of public health standards, his behavior during the coronavirus is something that's unthinkable from any president of my lifetime. And yours, and probably your listeners as well. And so to me, those are good examples of just the vast difference, the personal nature, the name calling, the bullying, the violation of norms, the assault on freedom of information, the hyper politicization of our Justice Department. Those are all things that I think are really specific to Donald Trump, the refusal to release his tax returns, as presidents of both parties have for 40 years. I mean, these are things that were so embedded in our political culture. We did not know, in fact, that we could have a president who would be so disregarding of those traditions. So, again, what's interesting is that many of those things have in common a sort of assault on institutions of democracy that in the past both parties had held to be sacrosanct.
So I'm going to try to turn to audience questions because there's a number on this. And I have to say, I apologize. I'm using my iPad. My computer had a failure. So if I start looking in weird directions, that's not you, it's me. So in a sense, how should we understand information coming from this White House then? Because you've mentioned that President Trump has broken so many norms over the course of his time in office, especially on something like his personal health at this point. How do you as a journalist interpret the news that you get and the information that you're receiving when you're trying to write your own stories?
Well, look, frankly, my experience and Peter's experience covering Russia and the former Soviet Union has proved to be far more useful than we ever would have imagined in Washington. A form of Kremlinology is required. Our colleagues at the Washington Post fact checker have come up with more than 20,000 misstatements, untruths, and lies told by the president in the course of his tenure. And that was, I believe, as of late summer. So that number has escalated since then. That is of a scale of misinformation and disinformation unlike anything we've ever seen, again, from any party. Presidents who were Democrats and presidents who were Republicans have lied to the American public. And specifically, they've lied about their health. But if you look at what's happened over the last weekend just alone, there seems to be a constant that the default setting is not to tell the truth. And, again, these are not inconsequential matters. We're not talking about little white lies here, people. We're talking about a situation where we're already in the midst of a pandemic where more than 200,000 Americans have died. On Friday at 12:54 a.m., they acknowledged that the president had tested positive for the coronavirus. They've never yet to this day, and we're 4 days into this now, told us when was his last negative COVID test and when did he first test positive. They've never told the American public that information. And of course, the doctors, outside doctors, cannot evaluate what they're being told about his medical condition because they've never been told when the disease began its progress with the president, number one. Number two, on Friday morning, you had the White House Chief of Staff come out and say that the president was experiencing very mild symptoms. Well, privately, in fact, it turned out that the president's oxygen levels had crashed, that he was running a very high fever, and that Meadows, the same person who was speaking to the media without a mask and telling them that it was mild symptoms at that exact moment, was extremely alarmed about the president's health and was urging him to go to the hospital. The doctors were asked about this. They did not tell the truth to the American people on Friday or on Saturday. And it was only after the fact that they acknowledged that they had taken him to the hospital because he had required oxygen and has now been put on 3 different very strong experimental therapies that are not available to the American public. So unfortunately, they do a good job of, sort of hurting themselves in terms of credibility. And at a time when we're in so many concurrent crises, what do we want? We want the straight truth. Like even if it's bad, and that unfortunately is the exact opposite. Jim Baker, he had a rule that he got very early on in his tenure in Washington in the 1976 campaign, his first exposure to the national press. And he was up against Ronald Reagan's team at the convention floor fight. Turned out to be the last floor fight ever, actually, in American politics. And John Sears was Reagan's campaign manager, and he turned out to have a problem, which is that he was BSing the reporters, and he was known for giving out what turned out to be wildly inflated counts of Reagan's support among the Republican convention delegates. Baker was much more cautious, and he tended to give out much more reliable information. And so when it was all over and Ford had won, Baker really was given credit. And the lesson that he learned was, don't lie to the media. And he really more or less abided by that throughout his long time in Washington. It served him well. Certainly he was aggressive in spinning the media or presenting events or facts that were favorable to him. But it's really the opposite approach from the White House that we see today.
Looking at the questions that we received from our audience, there's one from John, forgive me if I mispronounced the name, from John Gallis that I think really strikes at this in terms of Baker, this question of integrity in a sense. And he would like to know, how is it that Baker, as he put it, allowed George H.W. Bush to go back on his no new taxes pledge? Now, that concedes that Baker is perhaps more important than Bush or more powerful, but more pragmatically, where did Baker come down on fulfilling the promises, if you will, of the campaign versus, as you're saying, speaking honestly to the problems of the American people and to journalists, even if situations have changed?
Well, that is actually a fantastic question, because interestingly enough, it's kind of an example of what you pointed out in regards to Tiananmen Square. Which is Baker not wanting to touch a loser. And of course, this was literally a loser in the sense that arguably it's one of the main reasons that George H.W. Bush lost re-election in 1992, in the sense that it alienated a key part of the Republican Party base. It undermined his own argument for re-election. And Baker, interestingly, claims and told us in interviews for the book and has various evidence to back him up that he was skeptical from the beginning about this and that he knew it was a loser and he tried to stop it, but really it wasn't his portfolio and he was no longer involved in domestic political issues. And the record suggests he did speak up about it, but probably when it was already too late. And interestingly, even when he made the original pledge in 1988 in the convention, that was probably also something that Baker wriggled out of responsibility for. And the truth is that I don't think Baker would have supported Bush saying that in his speech. And there was a big fight over the contents of that speech that we recount in the book. But Baker was just coming in to lead the campaign at that moment, and in fact had not been running Bush's campaign during the primaries in 1988. He'd still been the Secretary of Treasury, and he had actually resisted and resisted and resisted coming in and letting Reagan kind of release him from his cabinet duties. And so that speech was being written before Baker really had full control over the campaign, and his advisors, who he trusted, kept trying to take it out, and it kept getting put back in, that no new taxes language. And so I find that one to be a really fascinating example where Baker arguably failed. Where he failed was not so much to stop Bush from going back on his word, but he probably failed to stop him from making the pledge in the first place. And he was somehow nowhere to be found in terms of using his clout to warn of the political risks when it was reversed.
That's really fascinating, because that really speaks to his recognition that even his own power, even as head of the campaign, or subsequently as chief of, or Secretary of State in that case, but also as Reagan's chief of staff before, recognizing that part of his job was also managing other people. In fact, we have a question here from Brendan McGuire, who asked specifically how Baker was in managing the egos, agendas, and competing priorities in the White House during his tenure as chief of staff. And as you point out, it's one of the most contentious periods in any White House history. So how did Baker manage to keep all these factions moving in the same direction, at least?
Well, that is really interesting. I mean, you could make a whole kind of like business book about Jim Baker too, and sort of, how he managed to navigate the Washington snake pit for a couple decades. And of course, the Reagan White House in its early years was the ultimate snake pit, especially because Baker had been set up almost to fail. I mean, what's interesting about it is that, he was brought in having been George H.W. Bush's best friend and campaign manager, brought in to manage the White House of the guy that he just run not one but two campaigns against, because he also ran Ford's. And that spoke obviously to their high estimation of his abilities, but it also spoke to, the intrigue surrounding Reagan that, a couple of Reagan's advisors, Stuart Spencer and Mike Deaver, essentially saw in Baker a potential ally to block Ed Meese, who had been, was known as the sort of ideological keeper of the flame of the Reagan Revolution, but he also was seen as a disastrous manager. His briefcase, they joked, was the place where papers go to die, and they were very fearful of what kind of presidency would ensue if Meese was the chief of staff, as he expected. But Reagan was very famously conflict averse, and essentially told Jim Baker, okay, I want you to be my chief of staff, but you've got to fix things up with Ed. And he left it to him to negotiate with his rivals. So you had this three-headed troika, is what it became known as at the beginning of the Reagan years. But they really weren't a match for Baker. We spoke with one person who said, every single day of that Reagan White House, Jim Baker gained power and the others lost it. And wow. He did so, I think, by essentially understanding the fundamentals about what constitutes power in any White House. And so he let Ed Meese have a fancy title, counselor to the president. He let him have cabinet rank, which Meese, being a novice in Washington ways, thought was a big deal, but Baker knew really didn't count for anything. And Baker, meanwhile, said, well, I'll just take care of those annoying administrative functions like personnel and legislative affairs and the press shop. And oh yes, I'll be in charge of all the paperwork that comes to and fro of the Oval Office. And oh yeah, and I'll just take this office that has been used by the chief of staff, which of course gave him the convening power. And he just played Meese masterfully. Essentially, that was what it took to be in charge.
That's wonderful. Actually, that speaks to a question that my friend Ray Termini was asking, was about to pose next, about how Baker managed to, in his words, outsmart Ed Meese. I think you've already answered that in a sense, but also go back a little bit further. Why did Baker, maybe I'm reframing the question wrong, when did Baker realize that Meese was going to be an adversary within the White House? Because it's not necessarily the case that you have to be adversarial with everyone. historically speaking, maybe today, not in the past. When did Baker see Mies as not a person who he could easily work with?
Well, first of all, he understood the game from the get-go. In fact, this intrigue began before the November election, sometime in the fall of 1980, and it's all recounted in the book there. In the fall of 1980 is when this plot began, and both Spencer and Deaver claim credit for the idea because, of course, it worked out very well. But they basically conspired with each other and with Baker to put Baker in front of Reagan, to get him some face time with the governor as he was campaigning in the later stages of the election against Carter. And there was a sense that they might win. So I think, Ed Mies believed that he would be given the job of chief of staff. So I think Baker was under no illusions that Mies was going to welcome him with open arms. And interestingly, it speaks to Baker's ability to work even with former adversaries. He maintained a relationship with Mies for many years. And in fact, in recent years, one of his essentially his last big assignment on the national stage was to head the Iraq study group when things were going very poorly in the Iraq war. And you know who he put on the Iraq study group after Rudy Giuliani was originally placed on there, but he wasn't showing up for the meetings, and he got basically kicked off. And it was Baker who suggested that they put Mies on in his place.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so part of me is sad that Peter left, but a bigger part of me is glad because now I can ask you this and get a better answer. Some people have been asking on our Q&A, and I'm curious too, two intertwined questions. Where do you find the time to write a book like this? But perhaps more importantly and more politically sensitive, how do you write a book with your partner in the midst of all that?
Well, the good news is we're still on speaking terms, as you saw. And in fact, we just celebrated our 20th anniversary.
Oh, mazel tov.
We started out working together and really have been so lucky to have both a professional and a personal partnership, for that entire period of time. We met at the Washington Post and worked together. We like to say we're the only good thing that came out of the Lewinsky-Clinton scandal, which is when we met. We actually did write a book together already in 2005 at the end of our time in Moscow. We wrote a book called Kremlin Rising about Vladimir Putin's rise. And we actually finished that on the day that our son Theo was born, not what we expected. So this one was easier in that sense. It was easier.
Well, Susan, Jeff, I want to thank, and Peter, I want to thank all of you. And let me read one of the comments from one of our viewers, from Steve. I've been reading your book for about 2 weeks. It is absolutely superb, detailed, and full of nuance and superior analysis. It's a major contribution to the record about the Reagan and Bush years. Bravo. And I think everyone who picks up a copy of your book, hopefully at Interrobang Books or wherever you purchase your books, you're going to feel the same way. And I know how busy you are, Susan. One of the reasons I subscribe to the New Yorker is because I enjoy so much your Thursday night column. Jeff Engel, thanks so much. Hope to see you on the bike in a few days. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you hopefully tomorrow or very soon. Thanks again.